Hello, dear listeners and those preparing to fall asleep. How are you? I hope you've had a good day. Right now, in the languor of a winter night, perhaps accompanied by a gentle breeze blowing through the window, you're lying peacefully alone or with a loved one. Lean back a bit. Take a deep breath and let my voice take you away. Today we'll be beaming into a very interesting world. Before these cool events happen, I'm curious. From which corner of Turkey is my voice reaching you? Or are you listening to me from a completely different geography in the world? And what time is it showing for you on this warm summer evening? Don't forget to share with me in the comments. Also, are there any historical topics you'd like for future episodes? I'm eagerly awaiting your suggestions. Warm greetings to all my friends who don't leave me alone, lost in the depths of history here every night. And you, dear listeners who have just discovered me, if you're not yet subscribed to my channel, subscribe now to continue these joyful journeys and don't forget to turn on notifications. If you'd like to buy me a virtual coffee with a small support, you can use the join button. Today I will take you to the Middle Ages. But this time, we won't look at epic wars or romantic loves, we'll have a deeper perspective. Money. Have you ever wondered why being rich in that period was almost an impossible dream? Close your eyes for a moment and think. Today, perhaps you dream of being an entrepreneur. Or perhaps you think you can rise healthily by developing yourself. The social layers you were born into, the amount of money in your pocket, the quality of the school you attended. Yes, these are important, but they don't completely determine your fate. At least on paper, everyone has a chance to rise. But what about the Middle Ages? What if you were someone born in the Middle Ages? What if your life path, how rich you could become, even who you could talk to, who you couldn't talk to, were predetermined from the moment you were born? Here, we are going right into the heart of that historical truth we will confront. The feudal social structure. In medieval Europe, feudalism wasn't just a story of landowners. It was a vast system encompassing all social, economic, and even personal relationships. In the simplest terms, it was a pyramid. At the top, the king, below him great lords, below them smaller lords, knights, and at the very bottom, a massive mass, the serfs. People like you. And your place in this pyramid? That was the biggest determinant of how rich you could become, how high you could rise. It was determined by birth. Was your father a peasant? Well, tough luck. You were most likely a peasant too. Was your father a lord? Congratulations. You would also be born a lord and your life would be shaped accordingly. What did this mean? Changing class, i.e., social mobility, was almost impossible. A dream like, "I'll become rich, I'll live in mansions," was as fanciful as dreaming of going to space. A peasant's son would work in the fields all his life, plant and harvest his lord's land, pay his taxes, and leave his children the same fate. Even if he were an apprentice in a guild, it would take years to become a master, and even then, the guild's strict rules would determine how much he could earn. The day you were born, your economic ceiling and floor were set. Your feudal lord, i.e., your master, owned the lands, and often even you and your family. You lived during his lifetime, under his protection. In return, you served him and paid your taxes. This service was usually agricultural work, compulsory labor, corvée, or even military support if war came. So if your lord decided to call you to work his fields, you couldn't say no. You couldn't leave your village without his permission. You couldn't pass into another lord's lands. Your economic freedom depended on your master's permission and whim. In this rigid system, meritocracy was non-existent. Intelligence, talent, or hard work were not magic wands that would suddenly make you jump class. Of course, very rarely, an extraordinarily talented peasant child might become a church leader or a soldier might be rewarded for bravery in war. But these were exceptions and didn't change the general rule. It was seen more like a one-in-a-million lottery win. The feudal structure also caused power and wealth to be concentrated in land ownership. Land was the primary source of wealth, and the vast majority of land was in the hands of the king, nobles, and the church. For an ordinary peasant like you, owning land was a dream, because all land already belonged to a lord. Without owning land, becoming rich was nearly impossible. The definition of wealth in this system was also different. While today we talk about wealth in terms of money and capital, back then it was measured more by land, military power, and the number of people. So, a lord was considered as rich as the land, serfs, and soldiers he had. For a peasant like you, saving money or getting rich through trade went against the nature of the system. So, this feudal social structure was the first and biggest obstacle that nipped your dreams of getting rich in the Middle Ages in the bud. It was like having your economic ceiling predetermined. Today, you walk around with a credit card, money in your bank account. You can shop online, make instant transfers. But what if you were someone living in the Middle Ages? How would you use your money? Answer: most likely you couldn't use it much. Because often, transactions weren't conducted with cash, but through barter and payments in kind. This situation created major financial obstacles to wealth accumulation and growth. With the remnants of the Roman Empire, centralized authority weakened in Western Europe, and trade routes disappeared. This brought about the collapse of the monetary system. New gold or silver mines weren't sufficiently explored, and coinage capacity was limited. Consequently, the amount of money in circulation was quite low. Imagine not being able to buy something because you don't have cash today. Back then, perhaps there was no such thing as cash. If you were a peasant, you would have very little to do with money on a daily basis. Instead of selling the wheat you grew in the field for money, you would grind it directly at your lord's mill, bake bread in the oven, and give a portion of your yield. You would even pay your taxes not in cash but with produce from the land or by working for your lord. This was called payment in kind. So you would tell your lord, "Here's this much of my crop." Not, "Here's this much gold." This made saving almost impossible because the value you received was a perishable or transferable product. How long could you store wheat? The barter system was another indicator of the weakness of the money economy. Need a pair of shoes? Maybe you would take your chickens to the shoemaker and try to barter. Need a doctor? Maybe you would give him vegetables from your field. This system got stuck when supply and demand didn't match exactly. If the shoemaker didn't need chickens at that moment, trade would stall. This situation caused the economy to slow down and hindered the development of large-scale commercial activities. You know how you use your credit card to buy things now? Back then, with a chicken in your pocket, you couldn't have a long shopping list. The weakness of the money economy also made investing and accumulating capital nearly impossible. If you had no cash, you couldn't start a new business, buy new land. You might not even be able to buy seeds for the next harvest. Financial instruments didn't exist. Banks, loans, stock markets, all of these were either very primitive or non-existent throughout much of the Middle Ages. Wealth came from land and human labor, not from liquid capital. In cities, the situation was a bit different. Money was more common among merchants and artisans. But still, it wasn't as widespread as it is today. Large commercial transactions were usually done with precious metals like silver or gold ingots, or through barter. This weak money economy was another major obstacle that limited economic mobility in the Middle Ages. No matter how talented or hardworking you were, if you didn't have the cash capital to trade or invest, your chances of getting rich were very low. The lack of money trapped you in your own small circle. We talked about how weak the money economy was and how it ran on barter. Now, think about how hard it would be to earn or keep what you earned in the Middle Ages. Because the feudal system shattered dreams of wealth not only with a lack of money but also with the heavy taxes and endless legal obligations taken from you by your lord, the kingdom, and the church. You know how you pay taxes to the state today? Back then, it was much more brutal and inescapable. As a peasant or serf, you owed your lord a series of obligations in return for living on his land. But it wasn't just a simple rent payment. It was a web of taxes and services levied on almost every aspect of production. One of the most basic obligations was the crop tax. After cultivating your field, you had to give a certain portion of the wheat, barley, or other crops you harvested to your lord. This rate could reach high levels, often 1/3 or even half of the total produce. So you would sweat for days in the field, put in your labor, but a large part of your labor would go directly to your master's granary. You know how we say tax planning hinders getting rich today? Back then, this feeling was much deeper. In addition to your produce, you also had the obligation of compulsory labor for your lord. Alongside your own field, you had to work for free on your master's lands, castles, or other projects for certain days of the week. You could be tasked with repairing your lord's walls, building his bridges, or digging his moats. These corvée duties stole time from your own field and distanced you from your own work. It was a situation of working more but not earning money. You had to pay taxes not only to your lord but also to the church. This tax was called a tithe. You had to give 1/10 of your crop, livestock, or other income to the church. The church was not only a spiritual authority but also a major landowner and an important economic power. These taxes helped preserve the church's power and wealth, further increasing the burden on you. In addition to these, there were various feudal fees and fines. Milling fee for using your lord's mill, oven fee for using his oven, market fee for selling something in the market. At almost every step, you could be forced to pay a fee. If you had a dispute and appeared before the judge, court fees and possible fines would emerge from your pocket. If you tried to marry without your lord's permission or tried to leave the village, you would face heavy fines or physical punishments. This heavy tax and obligation system made it nearly impossible for you to accumulate capital or get rich. No matter how much you produced, a large portion was taken from you as taxes and compulsory services. The amount left in your hands was usually only enough for your family's basic subsistence. A crisis, a sudden famine, or a war made this situation even worse. You could fall into debt and even into slavery. Your social status manifested itself in these tax obligations. Nobles, of course, did not pay taxes. On the contrary, they collected taxes from others. The tax obligations of merchants and artisans in the city were different. But they also had fees they paid to guilds and the city. However, the heaviest burden was always on the shoulders of the peasants at the bottom of the pyramid. These endless taxes and legal obligations were another major obstacle that dashed your dreams of getting rich in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the church was not only a spiritual institution but also one of the biggest economic and political powers in society. Its influence also negatively affected your ways of making money, including getting rich. According to the church's basic teachings, excessive wealth was a sin and seen as an obstacle to spiritual freedom. You know how they say money corrupts people? In the Middle Ages, this thought was much deeper and supported by religion. Jesus' words that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven reinforce this perception. Therefore, a pursuit of showy and selfish wealth was not looked upon favorably. One of the Church's most prominent and restrictive economic practices was the prohibition of interest, i.e., usury. While interest was a controversial topic in many cultures since ancient times, the Church classified interest, i.e., earning extra gain on lent money, as usury and considered it an absolute sin. This not only prevented Christians from lending money with interest but also from borrowing with interest. If you lent money with interest, you risked burning in hell. So how would this prohibition of interest affect you? Difficulty in accessing capital. Let's say you are a talented artisan and need capital to grow your business. Banks as we know them did not function, and since borrowing with interest was forbidden, accessing this capital was almost impossible. Who would give you money without interest and risk-free? This situation seriously hindered the emergence of small-scale and new economic ventures. Limitation on investment. If you had some money, you had no way to earn interest on it. You could invest in land or physical goods. But this also required large capital and did not provide interest income. So, the religious prohibition of money making money limited financial growth. Usury perception. Those who lent money with interest were generally ostracized from society and stigmatized as usurers. Those who did this business were usually non-Muslims, i.e., Jews, because their religious beliefs did not have as strict a prohibition on interest as Christianity. But they also faced discrimination from a certain segment of society. So if you entered this business, you would be ostracized. The Church also intervened in commercial morality. It criticized excessive profit, unfair pricing, and speculation, and advocated for the just price system. This meant a product should be sold at its cost plus a reasonable profit margin. These rules hindered free market economy and rapid wealth accumulation. However, the Church itself was also a major economic power. It owned vast lands, monasteries, and churches. It generated income from these places. Sometimes, despite its own rules, it was known to obtain interest-like income through certain agreements or loopholes, for example, under names like risk premium or service fee. So the Church itself could sometimes be flexible on this sin issue. As you can see, getting rich in the Middle Ages was not only constrained by practical obstacles, but also by the Church's religious and legal judgments. Interest restrictions made financial growth difficult, while the religious stigma attached to excessive wealth kept people away from the ambition of making money. Today, you have the internet. You can instantly access any information, learn a new profession, attend universities. In other words, the decrease in ignorance and the chance for self-improvement are limitless. But what if you were someone living in the Middle Ages? How much could you access the knowledge needed to reach your dreams of wealth? Answer: very, very limited. In the Middle Ages, education was not something you could just walk into, and this situation seriously limited your potential capacity, and thus your chances of getting rich. In the Middle Ages, education was far from today's public education services. The vast majority of society was illiterate. Literacy was generally a privilege reserved for clergy, monks, nobles' children, the ruling class, or scribes and some rich merchants' children. So if you were born a peasant, your dream of holding a book and reading would probably never come true. Most knowledge was transmitted orally or through written texts within very narrow circles. So how would this situation affect you? Occupational limitations. If you didn't know how to read and write, moving into high-income professions like lawyer, doctor, administrator, or international merchant was impossible. Your occupational choices were usually limited to continuing your father's profession, farming, craftsmanship, or doing simple, unskilled labor. You know how we say education is essential today? In the Middle Ages, in this sense, it was truly a line of fate. Lack of innovation and development. Limited education and skills blocked technological and technical innovations. Production methods continued for centuries without change, with the same primitive methods. New ideas did not spread. Consequently, it also reduced your chance as a producer to develop your own business and become more efficient. Because you couldn't access advanced skills, hindering social mobility. Education is one of the most important ways to move up in class. In the Middle Ages, this path was closed to most people. Literacy and higher education were tools of power in the hands of the noble classes and the church. As you remained uneducated, you stayed at the bottom of the pyramid. While there was a possibility of entering the church and rising as a clergy member, this too was only valid for a select few with certain talents. Economic ignorance. Information about money markets, trade methods, or ways to start a new business was often complex and the knowledge was scattered. However, this knowledge was kept hidden from the public or transmitted only to certain privileged classes. If you were such a person, you might never understand why a merchant was so rich. Because you had no access to his knowledge. Legal vulnerability. Not knowing how to read and write left you helpless in legal disputes. If there was a problem between you and your lord, you couldn't understand the records and couldn't defend yourself with written texts. This could open the door to arbitrary or unfair taxes against you. Being uninformed meant being weak. Although universities began to be established towards the end of the Middle Ages, they were institutions that trained clergy, lawyers, and doctors, and their doors were closed to ordinary folk children like you. The language of education, like Latin, was already a barrier most of us couldn't overcome. So, this was one of the fundamental reasons why getting rich in the Middle Ages was so impossible. The restriction of access to knowledge and educational opportunities limited your potential capacity and overall economic potential. Today, when you want to open a business, a bit of capital, an idea, and legal permits may be enough. But what if you were an artisan in the Middle Ages? When you tried to grow your own business or get rich, how much would the guilds allow it? Answer: not much at all. Guilds, while maintaining order, also acted as insurmountable walls in front of talented individuals like you. Guilds were the cornerstones of the economic and social structure of medieval cities. They were organizations that brought together masters, journeymen, and apprentices working in the same profession. These organized groups were a mixture of today's professional chambers and unions, but with a much stricter and controlling structure. The main purpose of guilds was to protect the reputation of their own profession and the interests of its members. However, while doing this, they didn't allow much external competition or rapid rise within the system. So how did these guilds limit your dreams of getting rich? Difficulty entering the system. To enter a profession, you first had to be accepted into a guild. This required a long apprenticeship period, sometimes 7 to 10 years, and then becoming a journeyman. During the apprenticeship period, you usually didn't get paid. You only worked for food and shelter. So you had to spend years of your youth without earning money. If you were such a person, your youth would pass in the shadow of a master without earning. Rigid hierarchy. Guilds had a strict hierarchy, apprentice, journeyman, master. To become a master, you had to wait for years, present a product called a masterpiece, and pass the guild's exams. Even after becoming a master, you had to obey the guild's rules. You know how there are promotion steps today? Back then, these steps were fewer and each one took much longer. Production and price control. Guilds controlled the quality of the goods they produced, the quantity of production, and sale prices. Their aim was to prevent unfair competition among members. However, this situation prevented you from earning more by producing more or selling cheaper. So you couldn't say, "I'll make more faster," because the guild's rules limited you. This prevented the emergence of free enterprise and created major barriers. Resistance to innovation. Guilds were generally tightly bound to traditional production methods and resisted technological innovations. Even if you discovered a new and more efficient method, it was likely that the guild wouldn't allow it or would hinder its application, because innovation could threaten the control and monopoly of existing masters. Preventing competition. It was nearly impossible for someone from outside, a non-member, to practice the same trade. To protect their own members, guilds restricted the opening of new workshops. They sometimes even excluded rebellious individuals. This didn't leave you with an opportunity like, "Let me start my own business, let me make a fortune." Social exclusion. Not obeying guild rules or doing unauthorized work could lead to your professional and social ostracism. This situation was very dangerous for survival in the Middle Ages, because being alone often meant being left out in the cold. Of course, guilds also provided some benefits. They offered social security to members, support in case of illness, and professional training insurance. But in terms of wealth accumulation, they were one of the most important barriers to individual entrepreneurship and capital accumulation. As you can see, even if you were an artisan in the Middle Ages, the strict rules of the guilds greatly limited your economic potential. Entering the system was hard, rising was harder, getting rich was almost impossible. Another major obstacle that dashed dreams of wealth was the constant state of war and general instability that was almost indispensable for that period. Think about it. Today you start a business, you have savings, but an enemy army could come and loot everything in your city. So if you were someone living in the Middle Ages, how would this constant state of war overturn your economic power? Answer: having a regular income, a safe investment, or saving was almost a fantasy. The Middle Ages was almost an endless chain of wars. Kings fought for land, lords to expand, cities for trade routes. Alongside major international conflicts like the Crusades, there were also endless feudal disputes at the local level, attacks by bandit gangs, and internal uprisings. This constant state of war deeply affected the economy and completely destroyed ordinary people's chances of getting rich. So how did these wars ruin your economic life? Destruction of agricultural land. Warring armies often burned fields, destroyed crops, or stole animals to devastate enemy lands. As a peasant, you would have cultivated your field, tied all your hopes to the harvest. But suddenly, armies pass over your field. They trample or burn everything. In 1 year, all your labor and livelihood could disappear. This meant not only poverty for that year but also for future years. You know the saying, "You buried your money." Here, you literally buried the labor you put in. Insecurity of trade routes. Wars and banditry made trade routes extremely unsafe. Merchants faced constant risk of robbery or confrontation while transporting goods from one city to another. This situation reduced the volume of trade, increased costs, and diminished the probability of getting rich through large-scale trade. Even if you were an artisan, it was difficult to find safe connections to sell the goods you produced. Looting of cities. During wars, cities were besieged, and when conquered, they were looted. Merchants' shops, artisans' workshops, people's homes, everything was plundered by the victorious soldiers. Whatever you had saved over years could be taken and carried away by a soldier in an instant. This was seen as one of the biggest risks to wealth accumulation from the start. Because even if you had money, protecting it was almost impossible. Population loss and labor shortage. Wars caused great losses among both civilian and military populations. A decrease in the population in a region negatively affected agricultural production and other sectors. The problem of not being able to find skilled labor, something we also struggle with today in general, was constant back then. This weakened the economy overall. Investment risk. The constant threat of war made any investment extremely risky. No one would make long-term plans, undertake large ventures, not knowing if the world would disappear in a war. Even if you had capital, you wouldn't know where to invest it, because everything could be destroyed. This continuous instability was the basic characteristic of the medieval economy. Without a safe environment, trade couldn't develop, production couldn't be planned, and people couldn't get rich. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't just people trying to outdo each other. Nature itself also presented enormous obstacles that threatened the economic climate and even the lives of ordinary people like you. Famines and epidemics. Think about it. Today you have your credit card, food in your cupboard. But what if you were someone living in the Middle Ages who suddenly couldn't find food, or if limited capacity knocked on your door? What would happen to your dreams of wealth? Answer: most likely, the struggle for survival would take precedence over everything else. In the Middle Ages, agricultural technology was quite primitive. There was no weather forecasting, modern irrigation systems, and very few methods to protect crops. This made the economy completely dependent on nature. If rains were scarce or extreme cold occurred, famines were inevitable. You know how supermarket shelves are always full today? Back then, they could empty suddenly, or might never even be filled. Famines didn't just mean being a little hungry, they led directly to mass deaths. Food prices would skyrocket. Even if you had money, finding food could become impossible. As a peasant, when the crop you planted and harvested for a year dried up, you would think about how to survive the next year. Hunger drove people to desperation. It could lead to theft, uprisings, and even terrible situations like cannibalism. Even if you had saved money, what could you do with your money when there was no food? Wealth meant nothing in the face of a hungry stomach. And naturally, the spread of disease. One of the most well-known and terrifying disasters of the Middle Ages was the Black Death. The 14th century plague destroyed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, and in some places, even more, turning cities and villages into ghost towns. But the Black Death wasn't the only example. Plague, dysentery, typhus, and other contagious diseases were always at the door. Understanding of hygiene was primitive, medical knowledge was insufficient, and outbreaks spread rapidly. If you were such a person, you might wake up one morning hearing your neighbor cough, and perhaps a few days later see yourself or your loved ones fall ill. Epidemics didn't just stop human life, they completely halted the economy. People couldn't work in the fields, shops closed, trade stopped. Even if you were an artisan, there would be no one left to buy your products. Fear and panic bulletins in society isolated people. Famines and epidemics constantly sabotaged efforts to get rich. Labor loss. Epidemics destroyed a large part of the population, wiping out the workforce. For example, after the Black Death, wages rose due to labor shortages, but for those who survived, the overall economic destruction was enormous. This situation also hindered capital accumulation and the continuity of businesses. This was the reality of the Middle Ages. Being born into a certain class, the weakness of the money economy, heavy taxes and obligations, religious restrictions, lack of education, the strict control of guilds, constant wars, and natural disasters. All of these formed an insurmountable wall in front of the dream of getting rich. So when you close your eyes tonight and lean back, think about how lucky you are to live in today's world. At least on paper, you have the chance to change your destiny. Perhaps that's the greatest wealth. I wish you peaceful dreams until we meet again in the next episode, in the corridors of history. No one was left to work the fields or run the shops. This halted production and paralyzed the economy. Demand collapsed. When people died or fell ill, demand for goods and services naturally plummeted. There was no one to buy the goods you produced. Price volatility. While famines caused food prices to skyrocket, epidemics could depress the prices of other goods. These constant and unpredictable fluctuations made long-term economic planning impossible. Social disorder. These disasters also disrupted social order. Uprisings, looting, and general chaos could emerge. Even if you had accumulated wealth, it was very difficult to protect it amidst these upheavals. These natural disasters were enemies that could knock on your door at any moment, fundamentally shaking your dreams of getting rich in the Middle Ages. Let's say you managed to produce something or engage in trade despite all these difficulties. How would you develop what you produced or your trade? In today's world, you can ship goods to the other side of the world within hours and track the cargo. But if you were a merchant or artisan living in the Middle Ages, how would you transport your goods? Answer: it would be extremely slow, dangerous, and costly. Primitive transportation and unsafe trade routes were major practical obstacles that sabotaged dreams of wealth. In medieval Europe, the sturdy roads of the Roman Empire had largely fallen into disrepair or decay. Instead, the so-called roads were often muddy paths, narrow passages through forests, or trails along riverbanks. So don't expect highways or asphalt roads. These roads were unsuitable for wheeled vehicles and could often only be traversed by horse, mule, or on foot. You know how you open navigation to go somewhere today? Back then, your best navigation was a local peasant. So how would this poor infrastructure ruin your commercial dreams? Slowness and time loss. Transporting goods from one place to another could take weeks or even months. This limited the volume of your trade and made the sale of perishable goods impossible. If you couldn't deliver a product quickly, you couldn't meet demand. Your profit margin dropped. Time was truly money in that era, and you spent it on the roads. High transportation costs. Transporting goods on your back or in small carts meant high costs for each unit. Shipping could double or triple the price of the product itself. This made goods reach their destination at a very high price, reducing competitiveness. You know how we complain about shipping fees today? Back then, the shipping fee could be more expensive than the product itself. Bad weather conditions. Roads became impassable in winter due to snow and mud, and in spring due to floods. This meant trade could completely stop for certain periods of the year. The seasonal nature of commercial activities made it very difficult to earn a regular income and accumulate capital. Road safety and banditry. In that period, states lacked strong central authority, and it was difficult to ensure the safety of roads. Forests, mountain passes, and deserted areas were where bandits and marauders roamed. As a merchant transporting your goods, you constantly faced the risk of being robbed or attacked. You know how we get insurance today? Back then, to protect your goods, you could only rely on the armed men accompanying you, and even their numbers were limited. One attack could instantly wipe out your entire wealth or earnings. Political extortion and tolls. Lords in the feudal system would charge merchants passing through their territory a toll, i.e., a passage fee. Traveling from one city to another, you might have to pass through the lands of dozens of lords and pay each one separately. This increased costs even more, making trade unprofitable. Risks of sea trade. Although sea trade was faster than land, it still had its own risks. Pirates, storms, and shipwrecks could make maritime trade dangerous. Insurance systems were primitive or non-existent. This carried the risk of losing your entire investment in case of an accident. Primitive transportation and trade barriers made establishing a widespread and profitable trade network in the Middle Ages nearly impossible. Even if you increased production, if you couldn't get your goods to market safely and quickly, your chances of getting rich evaporated. Today you work, save money. You invest your money, start a business, or grow your existing business. But if you were someone living in the Middle Ages, how would you accumulate capital and grow with what you saved? Answer: it was very difficult. In fact, it was often impossible. The economic system of that era essentially stifled large-scale capital accumulation and thus economic growth. Accumulating capital, that is, creating a surplus that you could spend or invest, was nearly impossible in the Middle Ages for several fundamental reasons. Excessive consumption and basic needs. If you were a peasant or serf, what you earned or produced was usually barely enough to meet your family's basic needs. In a period where famines and epidemics were rampant, just surviving was an achievement. There was no room for thoughts of luxury consumption or future-oriented investment. Any surplus was consumed as a safeguard for the next famine or epidemic, not as capital. Tax burden and fees. As mentioned before, a large portion of what you earned went to your lord the king, and the church as taxes and various fees. Compulsory services like corvée stole your time and labor. This constant bleeding ensured that very little remained in your hands to accumulate. You know how you complain that half your salary goes to taxes today? Back then, what was left might barely cover your expenses. Weakness of the money economy. Cash was scarce in the markets. Barter and payments in kind were dominant. If you didn't have a product that could be consistently converted into money, you couldn't even save money because there was no money to save. This deprived you of the luxury of saying, "I'll put my money aside." Prohibition of interest and lack of financial knowledge. The church's restrictions on interest prevented money from earning money through finance. Even if you had some money, you couldn't earn interest income by lending it. Banking and credit systems were either primitive or non-existent. This blocked the way to putting your money to work and earning income from it. You know how you deposit money in a bank and earn interest today? Back then, that was a sin and forbidden. Insecurity of property and instability. Wars, looting, and arbitrary practices by authorities meant that something you struggled to accumulate could be lost overnight, or taken by a lord's arbitrary decision. This discouraged people from saving, thinking, "Why should I save if I'll spend it anyway?" Because saving also meant having to protect it. Technological stagnation. Production methods remained unchanged for centuries. This meant that as an artisan, opportunities to earn more profit by producing faster, more efficiently, or cheaper were limited. Without technological advancements, production capacity remained fixed. This hindered capital accumulation and economic growth. Due to these difficulties, wealth in the Middle Ages was usually either a hereditary privilege, owning land, or achieved through rare and large profits from long-distance trade, which only a very small segment of the population could access. For an ordinary person like you, starting from scratch, accumulating capital and getting rich with that capital was made nearly impossible by the period's economic and social structure. Now, let's say you managed to save some money despite all the difficulties. If you were such a person, how would you evaluate these funds? How would you grow your business? Today, we have banks. You can get loans, invest, and store your money. But in the Middle Ages, such financial systems were either very primitive or non-existent. This created some of the biggest obstacles in the wealth accumulation process for someone like you, because you were deprived of the opportunities offered by modern banking. In the Middle Ages, there were no widespread, centralized banking systems like today. Institutions where money could be saved, stored, or processed were very limited. The closest thing to a bank might be a monastery treasury or a trusted merchant or goldsmith. This severely limited your options for utilizing your money. So, what were the effects of these primitive financial structures? Lack of interest protection and credit. The Church's prohibition of interest was the biggest obstacle to the development of credit markets. As a Christian, lending money to someone with interest was a sin and would brand you as a usurer. This made it nearly impossible for an artisan or merchant like you to access capital to grow your business. You know how you get a low-interest loan from a bank today? There was no such option back then. This blocked small investments and new ventures. Those who lent money with interest were usually non-Christians, specifically Jews, or North Italian merchants, Lombards. However, their activities were limited and they usually charged high interest rates. Problem of safe money storage. Even if you had some money, where would you keep it? Since there were no banks, you had to keep the money at home, which carried the risk of theft, fire, or loss in events like war. Places like a church treasury or a lord's safe were not easily accessible for storing money, and usually did not provide any interest or return. Cash scarcity. The weakness of the money economy meant the amount of cash in circulation was low. This made saving and transporting large sums of money difficult. Large commercial transactions were usually conducted with precious metals, gold or silver ingots, or through barter. Since a peasant or small-scale artisan like you didn't have much cash to begin with, this made saving even more impossible. Difficulty of large-scale and long-distance trade. Modern banking is indispensable for large balances and international trade. The lack of such systems in the Middle Ages forced merchants to take great risks. If you were a merchant, while transporting goods from one place to another, all your capital would be with you in the form of cash or valuable goods. This made it vulnerable to theft and loss. There were no survival tools like letters of credit or bank transfers. Absence of financial developments. Modern financial instruments like stocks, bonds, and insurance policies were either unknown or very primitive in the Middle Ages. This limited risk management and diversification of investments. If someone like you dreamed of getting rich by investing, the tools to realize that dream did not exist. These primitive banking and credit systems seriously hindered individual capital accumulation and economic growth in the Middle Ages. The lack of financial instruments and safe storage methods made it difficult to keep your money safe and make it grow, even if you had some. Now, if you were such a person in the Middle Ages, how sure could you be that the property you acquired truly belonged to you? Answer: not very sure. The uncertainty of property rights and the weakness of legal security in that period were major obstacles that shattered and prevented dreams of wealth. Today, no one can enter your registered field without permission, but back then, a lord's whim could take it from your hands. In the Middle Ages, property rights, especially regarding land, the main source of wealth, were not as clear and definite as they are today. The basis of the feudal system was that all land ultimately belonged to the king, and the monarch granted these lands to lords as fiefs or timars. Lords, in turn, gave the right to use these lands to peasants like you to cultivate. So, you did not have ownership of the land. It was your lord's property, and you were merely using it. This seriously jeopardized the security of your property. So how would this situation affect you? Arbitrary confiscations. Your lord had absolute authority over the land. If he found you unsatisfactory, if you made a mistake against your lord, or simply if your lord felt like it, he could evict you from the land. You know how you get upset when your landlord doesn't renew your lease agreement today? Back then, your lord could come one morning and say, "Get out, you no longer live here." And there was little legal process you could use to defend yourself. You had no right to the field you cultivated for years or the house you lived in. War and looting risks, constant internal wars and external raids increased the insecurity of property. Let's say you struggled and accumulated a few animals. An enemy army passing through could steal your animals or other valuable possessions. Even your own lord could demand goods from you by force to feed his soldiers or finance a war. So, even if you had property, there was no strong legal or military guarantee to protect it. Inheritance and heir issues. The lack of definite property rights also made inheritance difficult. For your children to inherit the land you used, they needed your lord's permission. Sometimes the lord's heirs might not accept the inheritance, or might demand additional fees. This disrupted intergenerational wealth transfer. You know how you're sure your property will pass to your children today? Back then, even that was uncertain. Lack of written records. Today, title deeds, contracts, and legal documents protect your ownership. In the Middle Ages, such written documents were very rare, especially among peasants. Legal processes were primitive, and the word of the powerful usually prevailed over that of the weak. Defending yourself in a dispute without written evidence was very difficult. Limited incentive for investment. If there was no guarantee that what you acquired was yours, why would you put effort into acquiring it? The uncertainty of property rights discouraged people from making long-term investments, developing their savings, or investing in other assets, due to the fear that they could be taken away. This slowed overall economic growth. For artisans and merchants living in cities, the situation was a bit better, but their property rights were also vulnerable to arbitrary practices by the monarchy or local lords. Particularly for some groups like Jews, even if they became wealthy, their property rights were much more fragile and their possessions could be confiscated from time to time. As you can see, getting rich in the Middle Ages wasn't just about making money. It was also impossible to secure it. The uncertainty of property rights, the threat of war, and arbitrary practices meant you could lose everything you accumulated in an instant. Today, we have legal security, judicial oversight, and transparency, at least in theory. But if you were a merchant or artisan living in the Middle Ages, how would you protect your earnings and goods from the arbitrary demands of authorities? Answer: it was quite difficult. In fact, sometimes it was impossible. The unlimited power of rulers could instantly dash your dreams of wealth, because the law was often on the side of the powerful. In the Middle Ages, central state authority was generally weak. Power was in the hands of local lords, counts, dukes, or city governments. These rulers acted like little kings within their own borders, and their power often stood above the law. So, laws existed, but what truly mattered was how merciful your lord or city administrator was. So how would this situation negatively affect your economic life? Arbitrary taxes and fees. We've talked before about taxes being heavy. However, these taxes were often not bound by specific rules. A lord could demand extra taxes or gifts from you whenever he wanted. If you were an artisan starting a new business or selling a product, you might be asked for extra fees. If you refused to pay, your goods could be confiscated or your shop closed. So, your earnings could be taken by the arbitrary will of a ruler. Confiscation of property. If you had acquired some land or valuable items, a lord might take a liking to these assets and confiscate them under various pretexts. He might accuse you of a crime, or simply say, "This land suits me better." Legal proceedings were often slow, complex, and expensive. As a peasant, your chance of claiming rights against your lord was very low, because the judge was usually your lord's man. Trade monopolies and bribery. In cities, monopolies or privileges over certain trade routes or goods could be established. These monopolies were granted by local rulers to specific merchants or guilds in exchange for bribes or special payments. If you tried to trade in an area outside this monopoly, your market access could be blocked, or your goods might not be allowed through customs. You know how people say you can't do business without connections today? Back then, this situation was much more widespread and systematized. Justice siding with the powerful, courts were often influenced by power and money. If you had a dispute and your opponent was richer or more well-connected, the likelihood of justice being served in their favor was high. For an ordinary person like you to stand against a powerful lord or a rich merchant in court required almost heroism. Personal safety being endangered, corruption and arbitrary practices threatened not only economic life but also personal safety. If you did something that displeased a ruler or acted against their interests, you could be imprisoned, tortured, or exiled. This showed that the pursuit of wealth was also part of a struggle for survival. This situation shows that in the Middle Ages, wealth often depended more on political power and personal connections than on a solid economic foundation. Protecting and growing your earnings was a constant game of vigilance, maintaining good relations with rulers, and sometimes even paying bribes. It was like living with the fear of a tax inspector knocking on your door, but that inspector's level of leniency had no standard. Today, you think about retirement, leaving an inheritance to your children, or making long-term financial plans. But if you were someone living in the Middle Ages, with life hanging by a thread, how would you accumulate wealth and pass it from generation to generation? Answer: it was very difficult. Because it was likely you would bid farewell to life before having a chance to leave an inheritance. In the Middle Ages, life expectancy was quite short compared to the modern era. Although it varied by region and period, the average lifespan ranged between 30 and 40 years. This meant that for someone like you, the chance of living into your 60s or 70s, seeing your grandchildren, and leaving an inheritance was very low. From birth, life began like a short-distance race. So how would this situation ruin your dreams of wealth? Child mortality. Infant and child mortality rates were incredibly high. It was possible for 1 out of every 2 children born to die before the age of 5. This kept your workforce and heirs under constant threat. There was no guarantee that your children would grow up to support you or inherit your wealth. You know how you invest in your children today? Back then, you couldn't even be sure you would live to see the fruits of that investment. Epidemics like the plague, dysentery, and typhus swept through medieval societies. Especially the Black Death in the 14th century destroyed over 1/3 of Europe's population. These epidemics also targeted people like you who were trying to accumulate wealth. Everything you worked for years to accumulate could become ownerless in an instant if you succumbed to disease. Wars and famines. As mentioned in previous sections, wars and famines were also important factors shortening lifespan. You could be killed by a soldier in your field or die of hunger in a famine. These sudden deaths prevented you from passing on your wealth in an orderly manner. The meaninglessness of capital accumulation. If life was so uncertain and short, how meaningful was it to accumulate large capital or make long-term investments? People focused more on getting by day to day and meeting their immediate needs. The future was perhaps the next harvest season, not savings years later. You know how we make retirement plans today? Back then, the concept of retirement might not even have existed for your lifespan. Intergenerational difficulties. Wealth and knowledge were usually passed from father to son or from master to apprentice. However, due to high mortality rates, if a father died early or children didn't survive, accumulated wealth would dissipate or fall into the hands of others. This made intergenerational wealth transfer, and thus the creation of permanent wealth, extremely difficult. Even the lines of great families and dynasties could be cut off due to epidemics or war. These brutal living conditions show that in the Middle Ages, wealth was not just about material accumulation. It also required a healthy population to enjoy and pass it on. For an ordinary person like you, in a world where life could end at any moment, having long-term wealth dreams was almost a luxury. Medieval cities were far from the million-strong metropolises of today. They were small settlements surrounded by walls, with limited populations. Cities were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and the church. However, their economic growth rates were quite slow. This situation directly affected the chances of someone like you getting rich in a city. So how did this limited growth shape economic power? Limited market and demand. Since cities were few in number, demand for goods and services was also limited. As an artisan, the number of potential customers who could buy your products was very low. This prevented large-scale production and thus the formation of large profits. You know how you can offer products to massive markets today? Back then, your market might consist of only a few thousand people. Labor and competition restrictions. Professions in cities were usually controlled by guilds. Guilds determined entry quotas, production quantities, and prices. This situation didn't leave you a chance to compete unfairly or earn more by producing more. There were strict rules against outsiders as well. This made it nearly impossible for an outsider to start a business from scratch in a city. Hygiene and health problems. Along with the dense population of medieval cities came serious hygiene issues. Sewer systems were primitive, waste was dumped into the streets. This caused epidemics to spread much more rapidly in cities. The risk of losing all your assets, and even your life, while striving to get rich in a city, was much higher. The probability of death was greater compared to the countryside. Fire and disaster risk. Houses in cities were usually made of wood and built close together, making fires a major threat. If a fire broke out, an entire neighborhood could turn to ash. Everything you had accumulated could disappear in an instant. Since there was no such thing as fire insurance, there was no chance of recovering these losses. Political and military instability. Cities were often targets of conflicts between lords or wars. Sieges. Looting and internal uprisings completely halted economic life and endangered your savings. Keeping your money safe in a city was at least as risky as in the countryside. Taxes and fees. Cities paid various taxes to their overlords and to the king or lord. As a tradesman or merchant living in a city, these taxes also limited your earnings. Customs at city gates, local fees. There was always a payment waiting for you. Of course, city dwellers had more commercial and craft opportunities compared to peasants in the countryside. Merchants, guild masters, or those involved in banking-like businesses could achieve a higher standard of living. However, even under these conditions, the path to great wealth was not that wide or easy and was always full of certain risks. Although cities were centers of wealth, this wealth was usually shared by a very small minority. This shows that while living in a city in the Middle Ages might offer you slightly more opportunities than living in the countryside, it was still filled with enormous obstacles to overcome to get rich. The limited size of cities and the accompanying problems made it nearly impossible for someone like you to accumulate great fortunes. Throughout the Middle Ages, production methods continued with techniques dating from ancient Rome or even earlier eras. Revolutionary inventions or groundbreaking developments in production were very rare. You know how a new phone model comes out every year today? Back then, the design of a tool could remain unchanged for lifetimes. This situation was one of the fundamental factors hindering economic growth and capital accumulation. So how did this technological stagnation negatively affect economic life? Low production efficiency in agriculture, simple plows, human labor, and animal power were still used in agriculture. Methods of sowing, harvesting, and irrigation were the same as techniques from centuries before. This resulted in very low output per unit area, i.e., low productivity. As a farmer, no matter how hard you worked, the crop your land could yield was limited. The lack of opportunity to produce more and earn more kept you trapped. Handicraft production and slowness. For artisans, everything was made by hand and one by one. A blacksmith forged each tool by hand. A weaver wove each fabric on the loom, thread by thread. This meant there was no such thing as mass production. The production process was incredibly slow, and the amount of product you could produce in a day was naturally limited. You know how factories hum with activity today? Back then, your workshop was like a personal marathon. This slowness hindered meeting demand and thus the formation of large profits. Limited energy sources. The basic energy sources of that era were human power, animal power, water mills, and windmills. Modern energy sources like steam power and electricity were unknown. This limited the ability to operate large machines or engage in large-scale production. With energy limited, production capacity was capped. Slowness of knowledge transfer. Even if a new invention or a better production method emerged, its dissemination was incredibly slow. Communication was weak, education was limited, and structures like guilds resisted innovation. So, even if a super idea emerged somewhere, it might take years to reach your village or city, or it might never arrive at all. Lack of incentive for innovation. The feudal system and the church's view of wealth did not encourage people to innovate and take economic risks. A mindset of getting by and not disrupting the system prevailed. This created mental barriers to technological developments and thus to getting rich. This technological stagnation was seen as one of the most fundamental reasons why the medieval economy remained stagnant. When production speed was low, innovations were slow, and energy sources were limited, the chance for someone like you to get rich by overproducing or inventing something new was quite limited. because the system condemned you to a slow and fixed economic cycle. In the Middle Ages, economic power was not determined by free market rules like the best product, the best service, but more by political choices and royal decrees. The king, a landowner, or a lord would grant special rights, i.e., monopolies, on certain trade routes, specific products, or information to his supporters or trusted individuals. These monopolies were like shields shouting, "Only I profit from this business." So how would these privileges affect you? Control of trade routes. Let's say you aim to make large profits on a trade route. The king or a lord would charge exorbitant tolls from every merchant passing through that route in exchange for protection. Sometimes certain merchants were given the privilege to use that route, blocking others. If you were such a person, you might encounter a sign saying, "This road belongs only to the X family," when trying to enter a city with your goods, and you couldn't trade. Monopoly on products in a region. For some strategic products, for example, salt, iron, precious metals, or certain types of fabric, production or trade was entirely under royal monopoly or granted to specific nobles. If you were a blacksmith and iron mining and processing belonged to a lord who sold it to you at a high price, your profit margin would drop to almost zero. Finding another source of iron was also nearly impossible. This eliminated competition in the sector and prevented small entrepreneurs from emerging. Marketplace privileges. Markets or fairs in large cities were usually controlled by local administrators or nobles. They determined which goods could be sold, who could set up stalls, and which prices were acceptable. While a merchant or guild might be privileged in the market, it became very difficult for an outsider or someone without privileges like you to do business. Differentiation in customs and taxes. Merchants under the patronage of the monarchy or lords could get discounts or exemptions on customs duties, but you had to pay the full fee. This increased your costs and reduced your competitiveness. So, favoritism existed back then too and was seen as a major obstacle in wealth accumulation. Legal immunity. Privileged individuals or monopoly holders usually had close relations with rulers, so they were also more advantaged in legal matters. If a conflict arose, they would have the support of a powerful lord or the monarchy. This ensured that justice was served in their favor. For an ordinary person like you, seeking rights against such privileged individuals was almost impossible. Resistance to innovation. Monopolies and privileges often resisted innovation and efficiency. Privileged groups profiting from the existing system prevented the emergence of new competitors or blocked better production methods, because this threatened their monopolies and profits. This system of privileges and monopolies shows that in the Middle Ages, wealth was determined not by free market rules like hard work and talent, but more by political connections and royal decrees. For an ordinary person like you to enter this closed and privileged system and make large profits was almost a fantasy. The economy was a playground in the hands of the powerful. The medieval social structure was based on a rigid hierarchy. At the top was the king, below him nobles, lords, dukes, counts. Below them were the clergy, and at the very bottom, the vast majority of society, peasants, serfs, free peasants, and artisans in cities. This stratification did not have a flexible structure. It was as solid as concrete. So how did this lock in your economic and social wealth? Status by birth. The family you were born into determined your entire identity. If your father was a peasant, you too would spend most of your labor in the fields. If your father was a lord, you would be born in a castle. This ensured that class mobility was nearly impossible. You know how people say, "He got the job through connections." Today, Back then, the family you were born into was your biggest gain or loss. Educational barrier. Access to higher education was already limited and usually a privilege of noble families or the church. For a peasant child like you, going to school, becoming literate, and thus having a better profession was a dream. Limited access to knowledge eliminated the chance of moving up in class. Restrictive effect of guilds. Guilds in cities tightly controlled the professional hierarchy. It took years to start as an apprentice and become a master, and even that was a system that tied you to a certain career status. It was nearly impossible for an artisan to earn a lot of money and suddenly enter the merchant class, because guilds prevented this. Land bondage and serfdom. The vast majority of peasants were bound serfs. You couldn't leave your village without your lord's permission. This left you no opportunity to seek new opportunities, travel to another city, or enter a different profession. Your fate was tied to the land you lived on. Harshness of laws. The legal system was generally designed to preserve the existing social order. There were no legal regulations facilitating class transition. A peasant trying to claim rights against his lord or move beyond his class could face severe punishment. Limited marriage opportunities. Marriages also usually took place within the same social class. A peasant marrying a noble only happened in fairy tales and was impossible in real life. This was another major obstacle to moving up in class through marriage. Of course, there were very exceptional cases. A peasant child could enter the church, become a clergyman, and rise in rank. Or a soldier could be rewarded for extraordinary bravery in war and gain a small piece of land or receive a knighthood. However, these were exceptions that broke the rules and usually required great luck or extraordinary talent. Out of millions of people, perhaps a few could rise this way. As you can see, the lack of social mobility in the Middle Ages killed your dreams of wealth from birth. Your place of birth sealed your fate, and breaking that seal required almost impossible effort. Wealth was usually a hereditary privilege or a luxury accessible to very few. And so, we have come to the end of our journey exploring why getting rich in the Middle Ages was nearly an impossible dream. We asked, could you have gotten rich if you lived in the Middle Ages? And we saw that the economic and social system of that era created enormous, seemingly insurmountable obstacles in front of individual efforts and dreams. For most people, wealth was just a dream, a hope that could never come true. We saw that in the Middle Ages, your economic destiny was determined at birth. The structure of feudal society meant that if you were born a serf, you would remain bound for life, essentially the property of your lord. The chance to leave the land, switch to another profession, or move up in class was almost zero. This meant your economic ceiling was drawn the moment you came into the world. The weakness of the money economy and the prevalence of barter made cash capital accumulation impossible. The products you earned were usually quickly spent on taxes and basic needs. The heavy tax burdens on you, the taxes you paid to your lord, the king, and the church, left no room for saving or investing. No matter how much you produced, a large portion was taken from you. The church's view of wealth and the prohibition of interest created major obstacles to financial growth and capital accumulation. Earning money with money, i.e., taking interest, was a sin. This hindered the development of banking and credit systems. It did not offer you the opportunity to access capital to grow your business. The restriction of education and skill development limited your capacity and prevented you from moving into higher-income industries. Literacy was a luxury for most people, and knowledge was in the hands of only certain privileged classes. The strict rules of guilds and cities meant that even if you were an artisan, they tightly controlled production, prices, and thus your earnings. They did not allow free competition. External factors also overturned dreams of wealth. Constant wars and political instability ravaged agricultural lands, made trade routes unsafe, and created the risk of losing everything you accumulated in an instant. Famines and epidemics brought both life and the economy to a standstill, making even survival a luxury. Primitive transportation and trade barriers made it impossible to safely and quickly transport your goods to distant markets. Corruption and arbitrary practices by authorities posed a constant threat that could take everything you earned from you in an instant. High mortality rates and short lifespans disrupted intergenerational wealth transfer and made long-term planning meaningless. The limited growth of cities and technological stagnation slowed economic growth. Royal and noble privileges, monopolies, and concessions blocked market progress and hindered small entrepreneurs. And above all, the lack of social mobility meant that the class you were born into was accepted as fate. Moving up in class or getting rich were miracles seen very rarely. In conclusion, in the Middle Ages, getting rich was nearly impossible for an ordinary person like you due to the combination of existing economic, social, legal, and religious barriers. The system was built to ensure that wealth remained in the hands of those already privileged. This period shows us in a way that our wealth is not only a product of personal effort but also of the economic system and social conditions we live in. I hope this dark and thought-provoking economic structure of the Middle Ages has offered you a different perspective. What other historical adventures would you like to embark on in the future? Don't forget to let me know in the comments. For now, good night.